Good morning and welcome back. Another Sunday school lesson here. Pardon me if my hair's a little disheveled, but we did a youth discipleship now weekend, and we did lock-in here at the church for 2 nights in a row. But that was really good. That was a blessing, and the kids got exposed to some really good evangelism, some really good preaching, and several churches came together, and it was just a really good weekend. So I'm tired. 2 weeks ago, I did a men's conference up in Tennessee all weekend long, and work and everything else. But it's a good kind of tired. So, anyways. Still doing Genealogy of Christ, and we're still talking about Jacob, and son of Isaac, who is son of Abraham. And I'm going to kind of go back to some of what we talked about last week with Jacob. Of course, he comes up Genesis chapter 30, and 30 through 35 is kind of his story. And he quote unquote steals his blessing from his brother Esau. And honestly, when you step back and look at it, he really didn't steal it. Esau sold it to him for a bowl of stew, or red stuff, as my Bible said. But I mean, it wasn't known to Isaac, and of course he had to trick Isaac into thinking he was Esau in order to fulfill Esau's promise to him. And we talked about that. Jacob meaning, it says trickster, but it's one who outwits somebody. And it really comes up when you study, when you learn, like when he went. Because Esau got mad about it and was wanting to kill him. So Isaac sent Jacob off to go find a wife. And he ends up meeting somebody from another side of the family, and it's Laban, and he sees his daughter Rachel, and he falls in love with her. So Laban decides he's going to pull a fast one on Jacob. And it wasn't Laban's tradition to marry off the second-born child. It was his tradition to marry off the firstborn. So when Jacob's all excited and probably drunk, whatever, he sneaks Leah in there, and suddenly Jacob finds himself married to Leah. And this is after working for Laban for 7 years. So, Laban could have said at the beginning, hey, you can't have Rachel because she's not the firstborn. But Laban didn't do that. So Jacob works for him for 7 years as a shepherd, and when he ends up with Leah, he cuts a deal to get Rachel as well. Well, Rachel couldn't have children, but Leah could. And so, we learned that Jacob, who later becomes renamed Israel by God, obviously that's where the nation of Israel comes from, and it's his sons are the 12 tribes of Israel. So, and actually, Genesis chapter 29 begins where they explain all of his children, and it's really interesting because, like I said, I got into this a little bit last week, because it mentions that Laban gives slaves to Leah and Bilhah as their servants. And he gives Leah Bilhah, and he gives Rachel Bilhah. Anyways, the 2 slaves are Bilhah and Zilpah. So, but Leah is able to have kids right off the bat. So you get Reuben, this is the very firstborn. Then you get Simeon, Levi, and then Judah. All right, big important asterisk by Judah. And then she stops having kids. So she has 4 kids, and she's done having kids for a while. So Rachel gives she couldn't have kids. She was upset, so she gives Jacob her servant Bilhah to have kids. Kind of, like I said, this is the same thing that Sarah did with Abraham. That's how we got Ishmael. And so through Bilhah, you have Dan and you have Naphtali. So then, again, Rachel's having issues with that. Leah pulls a fast one with some mandrakes, ends up with 2 more kids, Issachar and Zebulun. And then at some point, she gives Zilpah to Jacob to have more kids. Well, in the middle of all this, Rachel finally, God opens up her womb and gives her 2 sons. Now, only one of them was mentioned until you get to Exodus, where you learn about the second kid, but Joseph. And of course, Joseph is the one who gets everything set up in Egypt during the famine and saves everybody's life, right? It's the one they sold into slavery and told their father he was dead. So that's a big deal there. But Joseph is not the one whom God used to carry on the bloodline. It was Judah. Now, as I mentioned, you get into Exodus chapter 1 and you learn that Rachel has a second child named Benjamin. All right, and nothing special there. I guess he has some stuff going on in Exodus. But those are the 12 tribes of Israel. So you have Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin. And Benjamin is the youngest of the whole entire bunch. And as you get into studying these guys, they also had a sister named Dinah. Like I said, we see missteps. We see things going wrong here because Dinah where did that happen? In chapter 34 of Genesis, Dinah is defiled or raped. And the guy that did it tried to take her as a wife also, even though she didn't want anything to do with that. And when Jacob's sons returned from the field and they heard about what was going on, they got angry and they went and took revenge. And it really wasn't something they should have done. God was the one who was supposed to handle that. So, not perfect people, but this is who God chose to bring back salvation, to restore what was destroyed from creation. I mentioned that before. Genesis 1 through 11 is how man screwed up God's perfect creation. And then from chapter 12 through the end of Genesis is how God is establishing everything to restore his perfection, to restore his creation, so that we as humans could be what God intended us to be. So, and he takes the long road to do it, but ultimately it's for his glory and it's the way he decided to do it. But, it's interesting. And like I said, when you read about Laban, Jacob's father-in-law, and the stuff he tried to do, and the fast one he tried to pull on him, and he was, when God was blessing Jacob and his flocks and his herds and his family was growing and his wealth was increasing, and people start getting jealous of that kind of thing. So Laban was like, hey, how come he's increasing and I'm not, or I'm decreasing? So he tried to pull fast ones with Jacob and basically steal his flocks, kind of a thing. And just kind of petty, honestly. But God was blessing Jacob the whole time because, again, that's his chosen people. And like I said, when you get to in Genesis 31, Jacob finally leaves Laban to go home. And 32, he meets back up with his brother Esau, who wasn't mad anymore. He wasn't going to kill him anymore. Again, chapter 32, verse 24, where Jacob wrestles with God. God renames him Israel. Again, it's the beginning of the nation of Israel. So, 35, they finally get back to Bethel, and they get back to Jacob's hometown, Israel's hometown, and again, here it is right here, chapter 35, verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again after he returned from Paddan Aram, which is where Laban lived, and he blessed him. God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. You will no longer be named Jacob, but your name will be Israel." So he named him Israel. God also said to him, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply a nation. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation, indeed an assembly of nations, will come from you, and kings will descend from you. I will give you the land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, and I will give the land to your future descendants." And this is where Jacob named that place Bethel, because God had spoken to him. So, and you want to, here it is, a straight list. And this is, I mentioned Benjamin, and he's like got this honorable mention in chapter 35, verses 21 through 26, specifically in verse 24, where Israel's sons are mentioned, right? So this is the 12 tribes of Israel. And then, of course, Genesis gets into Esau's family, and, he's upset, he's mad about the whole thing still. It still kind of bothers him. He doesn't want to kill his brother anymore. But when Jacob went off to get his wife, and his mother said, "Do not get a wife from the Canaanites," that's exactly where Esau goes to find a wife from the Canaanites, and he actually marries a woman from Ishmael. Of course, the town named for Abraham's first son, Ishmael, who was not the legitimate son. He was the illegitimate one. He was not the one that God ordained to carry on the bloodline. So that gets into all the way up through Genesis 36. It's important to note, and the reason we're told all this stuff is because as you read on, as you get into Exodus, as you get on into Kings, and as the Israelites come out of Egypt, and they are eventually going into the promised land, which is the land of Canaan, and they have to drive out all of God's enemies, who are also their enemies. So, this stuff is mentioned because it gives you an idea of where these people came from. Where do these tribes, these pagan, idol-worshiping, child-sacrificing tribes, where did they come from? Well, they're descendants of Ishmael. They're descendants of Esau. They're the descendants of, some of these people are descendants of Cain. And these are the people who choose not to follow God. These are the people who went away from God instead of staying with God. And that causes a lot of problems for the nation of Israel. They're causing us problems today, not just in the Middle East, all over the world. There's people not choosing to follow God, and they cause problems for those of us who do choose to follow God. But, it was prophesied that there would be a famine and that Israel would spend 400 years in Egypt, which gets us into Joseph. Now, I realize Joseph is not in the lineage of Christ, I mentioned that earlier, but it's interesting that God said, hey, there will be a famine. Not that I think God set it up to be like that. He just looked through time. He looked forward in the video, so to speak. From his 10,000-foot view outside of space and time, he looks down and says, okay, there's a famine coming up. There's a time of drought. There's weather patterns are going to match this, and this is going to happen. And it's going to happen over here. Well, that happens to be where my people are. That happens to be where Israel and his children are. So I'm going to set it up where they can end up in Egypt where there is no drought and they can survive. So if you are familiar with Joseph at all, right? There's been movies. There's Joseph in the Broadway play, Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son. And he would have these dreams of his bunch of wheat was standing up and all the other wheat was laying down. And his brothers, everybody thought he was nuts. His father too. Why would you as the younger son be worshipped by your older brothers? What's going on here? So Reuben and the other brothers decide that they're tired of putting up with Joseph. So they decide they're going to kill him. And they take him out in the field, and they all decide all this, and then Reuben has a change of heart. He doesn't want to kill his brother anymore. He just wants to get rid of him. So let's make it look like he died and got eaten by a wild animal, but let's sell him into slavery. So they sold him to Egyptian slave traders. And then Joseph ends up in Egypt. He ends up working for Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife gets the hots for him, and he knows that she's married and he doesn't want to do things against God, so he refuses, and then she gets him thrown in prison, falsely accuse him of assaulting her, and he spends time in prison, and which that's chapter 39, verse 21 is when he ends up in prison. But, God is with him the whole time. He's blessing him. He's taking care of him. He's looking out for him. Potiphar was a captain of the guard for Pharaoh. So he wasn't just some ordinary Egyptian or just somebody with a lot of money. He was somebody with a high position. And, he did well. Joseph did well working for Potiphar and managing Potiphar's house. So, he ends up in prison. God gives him favor with the prison warden. So he ends up in a high position in prison. The warden actually put prisoners under Joseph's authority, and that's again chapter 39, verse 22. And then for chapter 40, he interprets dreams, and word of that gets out so that in chapter 41, when Pharaoh's having these dreams and he doesn't understand it, let's see here, at the chapter 41, verse 1, at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing beside the Nile with 7 healthy-looking, well-fed cows, came up from the Nile and began to graze among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, sickly and thin, came up from the Nile and stood beside those cows along the bank of the Nile. The sickly, thin cows ate the healthy, well-fed cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. Chapter 5, verse 5. He fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 heads of grain, plump and good, come up on one stalk. After them, 7 heads of grain, thin and scorched by the east wind, sprouted up. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 plump, full ones. Then the Pharaoh woke up, and it was only a dream. So, he's having problems. He doesn't understand what these dreams mean. He doesn't, what's going on here. Word gets to him that Joseph can interpret dreams. So they bring Joseph before Pharaoh, and there's going to be 7 years of good harvest and wealth. There's going to be 7 years of prosperity. Then that's the healthy plump cows. That's the healthy plump reeds and stuff. Then the sickly cows that eat the healthy cows, right? There's 7 years of famine coming after that. So because he's able to understand the dreams, which again, God helps him with this. We see this actually with Daniel later on. God can work through dreams. And God blesses Joseph in that he's able to interpret these dreams. So Pharaoh then takes Joseph and puts him in charge of all the food production for the whole entire nation of Egypt. And Joseph begins to store up grain and manage the grain so that when those 7 years of good harvest, he's able to have food stored up so that in the 7 years of famine that they survive. And again, he's in Egypt. His father thinks he's dead. Jacob, Israel, thinks he's dead. And at some point, here in chapter 42, Joseph's brothers go to Egypt looking for food. They're down in Bethel and in that area, and they're having trouble, and they're hungry, and they realize their food's about to run out, and they're like, hey, let's go to Egypt and buy food because they have food over there. So Joseph recognizes his brothers. They don't recognize him. So he does pull some fast ones on them. He sets them up and kind of gets them in trouble, makes it look like they're stealing. And he uses all this. They go get his father. Benjamin comes into the picture. And Joseph finally reveals himself to his brothers. And this is everybody's famous, one of those famous verses everybody really likes. Let's see here. Okay. All right, chapter 45, Joseph reveals his identity. And of course, his brothers all thought, Judah, Reuben, everybody all thought they were going to die, that he was going to take revenge on them. Okay, chapter 45. Let's see here. Starting in verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come near me. And they came near. I am Joseph, your brother, he said, the one you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves for selling me here, because God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there will be 5 more years without plowing or harvesting. God sent me ahead of you to establish you as a remnant within the land and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Okay, so he says, hey, basically, you meant this for evil, God meant it for good. That's the verse we all know. And people are going to try and do things to you. People are going to come after you. They're going to falsely accuse you. And part of what happens is your reaction. It's looking at this situation as a regular person. It would be perfectly justified for Joseph to want revenge on his brothers, and it would have been acceptable in society's eyes, especially at that time, if he had just killed them all. But he recognized God's hand through the whole process, and that he was blessed, and that despite ending up in prison, he was still well cared for and still well fed, and he was placed in positions of authority so that he was able to save his family. And so, that's kind of the way God works. God takes our circumstances and he turns them to his favor if we let him. Oftentimes, we get so caught up in what we're doing, what's going on. We get caught up in the excitement of the moment, the emotion of the moment. Somebody wronged us, somebody did, whatever. And it's so easy to blame other people rather than looking for the blessing that's hidden, or looking for, how can my reaction benefit God? And, as I said, God knew that these things were going to happen. God knew that Joseph was something. That's why he was giving Joseph these dreams before his brothers decided to get rid of him. God was setting the stage for these things to happen. And it was his way of preserving his chosen people, the remnant of his chosen people, so that the bloodline would be preserved that would eventually lead us to Christ. It's God's ultimate plan. And, I've said this before, certain people in the Bible, I think, could have been anybody. But there are fixed points. And, obviously Adam is a fixed point. Noah was a fixed point. Abraham, which I think anybody could have answered, but God knew by looking forward into the future of our timeline. Again, God's outside of space and time. So, that's why we say he's the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, because God's able to look ahead of our lives and know the decisions we're going to make. He's not ordaining us to make those decisions, but he knows where our hearts are, and he knows what we're going to do when we're put in certain situations. So he knew that Abraham would answer his call. And, he knew that Jacob would do what he was going to do. But I think Joseph here, because God specifically gave him dreams at a young age, I think he's a fixed point. So, could it have been one of his other brothers? Possibly, but God picked Joseph. And Joseph was able to, through God's guidance and blessing, put himself in a position by serving others. I think that's something we need to pick up on here. Joseph didn't get all despondent and depressed. He looked to make the best of a bad situation. He got sold into slavery. So what did he do? He treated his master with respect, and he worked hard for him. He gets promoted to be the head of the house. And he ends up in prison. He could have been all depressed and despondent and really upset, but what does he do? He does what he's supposed to do as a good prisoner and gets placed in charge of other prisoners by the warden. So, and I'm sure he probably had opportunities he could have escaped. He could have ran away, but he stayed there despite being falsely accused, and he took responsibility and took that position. And then that afforded him the opportunity to be able to come before Pharaoh. And again, he could have turned around and hightailed it knowing that there's this famine coming, but what does he do? He sticks with it, and he serves his masters. And because, he's doing that, he gets blessed. So he goes from being working for the captain of the guard to prison, all of a sudden to being governor of Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. He's number 2 guy in the whole entire land. He, as an Israelite, is telling all these Egyptians what to do and how to do it. So when all of his brothers finally come up into Egypt to live, there was 66 of them total, or 65 to 70, and that is, I believe, mentioned in Exodus chapter 1. But, and like I said, they were there for 400 years. Now, it didn't take too long before they began to multiply so much, from 66 people, 66 to 70 people, they grew to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, in 400 years. And as you read into Exodus, you find out that the original Pharaoh, who loved Joseph, passes away. Well, the next Pharaoh decides he doesn't like Joseph. Joseph had passed away. He wasn't familiar with who Joseph was or what Joseph had done, what the Israelites had done to save Egypt. And he decides he's going to actually enslave the Israelites. So at that point, the Israelites were not slaves. Well, then this next Pharaoh comes along, And he's concerned because there's actually more Israelites than there are Egyptians. And he's thinking they're going to overrun us and they're going to take our country from us, right? So he enslaves them. And the whole time they're in Egypt, they're actually starting to pick up really bad habits like worshiping false idols. That's specifically mentioned. And, that leads into, like I said, leads into Exodus. It leads into a point at the end of the 400 years, which again, God said you're going to be there for 400 years. And in order to get them out of their quote unquote comfort zone, we all have that comfort zone. We get used to living in a certain area. Seeing things that are wrong to God seem to be okay with man. Think back to Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah. And here's Lot living next to Sodom, and or living in Sodom, and they're evil. I mean, their sin was great. It wasn't just homosexuality in Sodom and Gomorrah that was the problem, because they were just corrupt all the way around. So corrupt politicians, corrupt business deals, child sacrifice, and here's Lot, who knows better. But it's common. It's what they do. And he's not going to, he himself and his daughters and stuff, they stayed true to God, but they didn't do anything to try and stop what was going on around them. And it just, they kind of went with the flow of things. And that has gotten us in trouble today as a church, as Christians. We have sat back and watched our government fail. We have watched our politicians fail morally, and we've really done nothing. We've said nothing. It's, hey, as long as we got that stimulus check. Hey, as long as the stock market's up. Hey, as long as there's food on the shelves in the grocery stores. As long as I got gas in my car. We're okay. It doesn't matter that our politicians are doing, really weird things to children. It doesn't matter that they're conspiring with other governments. Or they're making backroom business deals that screw a lot of people. None of that stuff matters as long as we're prosperous, right? As long as we have money and can support our families. So what we see today is not new compared to what was going on back in these days. And aside from the fact that the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, they thought that was normal. That was okay. That, as long as they were well fed, and as long as they were cared for and had a place to live, it didn't matter that they were being beaten by slave taskmasters, building the pyramids and mining the turquoise mines. I was thinking about this the other day and couldn't remember it, but they have found these massive turquoise mines in Egypt, and they have actually proven this part of the Bible to be true because they have found cave paintings and drawings and writings that they have verified to be from the Israelites. So there is actual proof. They found proof hidden in Egyptian museums. Like I said, they found these caves that used to be these old turquoise mines. And, excuse me, that's where the Israelites were forced to work. So this is true story, folks. This is true stuff. There's evidence all over the place to confirm it and to prove it. So, keep that in mind as you deal with your situations, as you are struggling with something, somebody tries to get over on you. How are you going to react? Is it possible that you can turn or that with God's help, you can turn a bad situation into a good one? Somebody may have meant something for evil, but God turns it for good. And if you stay true to God, you will, if you respect the authority around you. I've been in jobs where my managers and stuff have been horrible. But I did the best I could to just do what I was supposed to do. I agreed to work for a certain amount of dollars per hour and to do a certain job. So I made sure I did that job. Even if I wasn't there that long, I could then go to the next job and say, hey, and when they call for a reference back to my old boss can only say, he did what he was told, and he did his job the way he was supposed to do it. So, you may not be in the best place, but if you put your focus on God and you do the best that you can do in the situation, then God is able to bless you. But if you get all despondent, if you get all in the emotion of things, if you want to stay mad, people like to stay mad. I don't get it. Being mad takes so much energy. Being angry. If Joseph had been an angry person, he never would have been able to get into a position where he was able to save his brothers and to save the tribe of Israel. The nation of Israel. Yes, I get mad. Yes, I have moments where I'm upset, but it's not for very long. Because I figured out a long time ago, even before I was a Christian, that staying mad is not helpful. If you're angry, you don't make good decisions. If you're sad, you don't make good decisions. They're not well thought out. They're not logical, and then you just end up in worse trouble than when you started. So if you do like Joseph did and keep your focus on God, and you respect the authority around you, you can work yourself out of a bad situation into a better one and then move on from there. So again, of the 12 tribes of Israel, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, Joseph, and Benjamin, when you get further into the Old Testament and you see, especially once they leave Egypt and enter into the Promised Land, in the land of Canaan, when they start to take the land, of course God goes before them, when they start to take the land, these are the tribes that get the land divided up. So the whole nation of Israel is divided into 12 pieces of land, and these different tribes get them according to their size and what their role is. And like I said, Judah is the one who God chose to carry on the bloodline. And it's interesting because Judah's in on the plot to kill his brother. And Judah's not even the one that has the change of heart. Reuben is the one that has the change of heart to not kill him, but rather sell him into slavery. So, for whatever that's worth, but eventually, the tribe of Judah is where the leadership for Israel comes from. It's eventually where the kings of Israel come from. And that will eventually lead us to Christ, who will be the ultimate salvation, the ultimate restoration for God's creation and for God's glory. So keep that in mind today, and as you go about your business during the week, what somebody else meant for evil, God can make it for good. So, that's it for today, and I hope and pray that your day is blessed, that your week is blessed, and, go to church. Find church somewhere. If you're not coming here, go somewhere else. Get around other believers. Forsake not the body of believers. Matthew 10:25. I just put that out there on the church sign yesterday. We're here. I'm here every Sunday, regardless of whether anybody else is here or not. Sharon's with me. There's always somebody here. And it's very difficult for you as an individual to stay true to God if you're not around other believers. I'm not saying you can't do it, but it's a lot easier. Like if you have a fire going and you take an ember out of the fire, take a chunk of wood or whatever you're burning, coal, and you pull it out of it. It's red hot and it's glowing and there's flame coming out of it. You pull it out of the fire and you set it a few feet away from the fire by itself. It eventually, within a few minutes, it's not even red anymore and it becomes cold. You take that and put it back in the fire, it starts burning again. And of course, fires are what? They're good for heat. They're good for light. Fires, controlled fires, campfire, house fire, an oven or something is good for people. So being on fire for God is a good thing. So keep that in mind. What somebody else meant for evil, God can turn it for good. And that you should not forsake the body of believers. So, we've got this stuff. We're getting this stuff figured out. Life's getting back to normal. States are opening back up. They're taking away these mask mandates by and large. I mean, Alabama's not for some strange reason. Everybody else around us is. But, we're getting used to the way things are going. There's no excuse anymore to not be in church. So, God bless you, and I'll see you next time.